Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore, Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of this show is Injustice for All, the series, because it was decided that injustice never ends. The discussion and the abatement of injustice can never end. So we're back again, and I have Mariel Johnson back. I'm glad you're back with me, Mariel. And I held on to attorney Marian Perkins because, you know, she's my good old university professor, lawyer who knows a lot of stuff that we want to talk about. And she's been doing her work in the area of human trafficking and just recently returned from Oxford, England. I'm sorry. That's right, Oxford, England. I almost thought I was talking about London, where she attended a symposia on injustices, gender injustice. And so we start out looking at gender injustice, but once we start talking about injustice, it sort of takes on a life of its own because it's so pervasive in this particular society and in other societies as well, but we know more up close and personal about what goes on here. And the course that you teach at Chicago State is?
Several courses: Women in Criminal Justice, Juvenile Delinquency and the Juvenile Justice System, and Victimology. And I always teach Introduction to Law.
Okay, so victimology interests me, the study of victim, the study of the victim. We have to be very precise here because I spent a lot of years of my professional life fighting against victim analysis, because usually in a society that oppresses people, they make the victim responsible for their victimization. And so whenever the victim is complaining about his lot or his plight, generally they go and find some malady, some deficiency that the victim has. You know, the victim is a high school dropout, comes from a broken home, mother's unwed, father's on alcohol or some other drug. You know, they always find reasons within the victim's profile for why the victim is victimized. And so if you're doing victimology, I'm hoping that you are not making victims responsible for the abuse that they suffer because of their impotence in this society.
Correct. Absolutely not. It is basically about analyzing perpetrators and what they do to victims, and also talking about tools to give victims to empower themselves, and some tools that some victims have to even prevent crime in terms of resilience and some other things that they do have. But it definitely is not about blaming the victim. It's about educating society about that there are so many ways that are used subtly and not so subtly to blame the victims, and that's particularly when it comes to cases of sexual assault, domestic violence, and even when you start talking about human trafficking. At one point, they were prosecuting the victims, and now the United Nations protocol to end trafficking is very specific that the girls are not to be prosecuted in the United States of America or in the other countries, so that you can make it very clear that these people are not victims. They are being lured in tours of the perpetrator, and that the emphasis needs to be on the criminal, not on the victim.
They're not perpetrators.
They are
not.
They are
victims. I know that, you know, let me introduce you to Mariel Johnson, because you may not know Mariel Johnson. Mariel Johnson's been the forefront of fighting injustice in all the forms where she finds it. And she was, you know, very, very active, you know, in opposition to the death penalty, because if you want to see victimization taken to its most absurd extent, it is to take the life of someone because that person is unable to defend himself or herself against the authority of the state. Talk something about your experience, Mariel.
Well, Actually, when I got involved, I was walking into something, had no idea that it was like that, because I was one of those persons who believed in the system. I was raised up to respect this country, you know. And when I went and when I started visiting death row, I came in contact with people who were actually victimized by the system. And they are so vulnerable because the average citizen has no idea of what the system is doing to people. They victimize them, and then, as you say, they blame them, and you listening for them to protect you, and they're the ones who put the banner, you know, the brand you. And it gets to the point where you listen to things over and over, and at one time I would not have actually been able to listen and believe things that I heard, but I experienced something. And it was through my disappointment in my efforts to bring and enlighten other people to what was going on in my life that made me just turn over and decide to go into the system. And I went in there helpless. But I had ears that were open because I wanted to hear what was going on. And when I started to communicate with people on death row, it was so enlightening because I could relate to them, because the things that they were telling me were things that I had experienced. Whereas if I hadn't experienced it, I doubt if I would have had the kind of empathy that I had, because I believed in the system. See, that's the sad part. We are raised up to respect this country. And like you said, the legislators who are there supposedly to represent us, they're there for their own self-interest. They have no attachment at all to people in the community. They have no care for these young people whose lives they contribute to as far as destroying them. They take these youngsters and they try them as adults. And these are all victims, victims of the system.
And then they do a huge amount of plea bargaining. I had one friend who left her law practice because she said she had just grown tired of, for every case, you know, they were threatening these young people with these huge and lengthy sentences, and so if they would plead guilty of something, a lesser crime, then they would be able to give them only, you know, a shorter sentence than that was the promise that was made.
They turn the victim, again, he's victimized.
Right.
Because if they would ask for a jury trial, it would throw the system
Absolutely,
into chaos.
yes.
They couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
See, so they have these young people who bargain away their lives. It was one young man who was on death row. They executed him. He pleaded bargain. What did he get out of it? A death sentence. My son, he was offered 15 years, 10 years, 6 years, and then finally they asked him what would he take. He said, I wouldn't take 15 minutes anymore for something that I didn't do. I'm going all the way with it. He went all the way, and they gave him life. So this is the way the system works. If you don't cooperate with them, you are punished. They make an example of you.
No, they make a victim of you.
Again,
Right.
over and over you're victimized.
Well, one thing, 80, you're totally correct. Most of the cases are pled out. Only about 15% of the cases go to trial, and you're right. Whether or not it's a bench or a jury trial, and it does. The system would fall apart if
It couldn't
all
handle
of the
it
people
if people
did
would
go
ask
to
for a trial.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm sorry to hear about what happened with your son. There is something that's called the jury tax, that when sometimes, not all judges, but some judges, that when the person does ask for a jury, then sometimes they can get a more severe sentence than if they had pled out.
Yes.
So,
well, they asked my son, eventually say, what will you take? They was just disgusted with him. They didn't want to take the case to, trial because they knew it was a frame up anyway. But when he asked for that trial, he ended up being tried by an all-white jury.
What year was this?
This was in '88, I think it was, down in Bloomington.
But you see, it's not a win-lose situation. You cannot ever say that you will be treated justly in a system of unjust laws.
That's right.
So, it's a crapshoot. Maybe you plea bargain, maybe you get a reduced sentence, maybe you plea bargain, maybe you get life, maybe you get the death penalty. Because the laws govern the criminal justice system, even down to the sentencing. Now there's sentencing guidelines, and so that even human compassion, human judgment cannot come into play, because the sentencing has guidelines, and this is what has to be the parameters of the sentence for this crime. And then at one point you had what I never understood was these C numbers. These people who were undefined, they weren't guilty of larceny or whatever. They were some category of crimes that didn't have a definition.
Yes, I can elaborate on that. What happened was Illinois used to have an indeterminate sentencing structure. And what an indeterminate sentence is that you would serve a length of time, but if the correctional guards felt that you were a good prisoner, you would be released for good behavior. Illinois moved to a determinate or a fixed sentence structure now. So when a first person gets a sentence today, they're going to get a determinate fixed year, and so they're going to have to serve that particular years. Except we know under the Truth in Sentencing Act, you're going to serve 85% of your time if it's a violent crime. Before the Truth in Sentencing Act, a person would serve about 50% of their prison time. Now, the indeterminate, the people who are in the C prisoners, they are under the old law, and so they've got to go before the Illinois Prison Review Board, used to be called the Parole Board, to get to see are they going to be released. Now, what has happened is there's been a lot of focus placed on the C prisoners, so hopefully most of them are supposedly coming before the Illinois Prison Review Board, but they are people who are actually sentenced at a time period when the point of the indeterminate sentencing was we want to reward good behavior. So it's acknowledging that you have done the crime and should be sentenced, but versus giving a person a fixed number of years, if you give someone a reward them for good behavior, then you're actually giving them an incentive to be rehabilitated. All of that is now gone now that Illinois, along with so many of the states, have moved to a determinate sentencing structure. It's one of the biggest changes in the sentencing structure that has led to some of the biggest problems that we have today.
Sometimes it amazes me that somehow, even when legislators pass laws that are intended to resolve problems and issues, that somehow they don't get to do that.
Right.
Right, I know. I think about just the current mortgage program, that some legislation was enacted that was supposed to relieve people who were having difficulty meeting their mortgage loans, paying off their mortgage loans and so forth and so on, and people were supposed to be able to go into loan modification programs, and they would get a certain period of time where they could pay a reduced mortgage payment, and then at the end of that period of time, if they were on their good behavior, then perhaps they could keep that reduced mortgage payment and be able to get some relief of the mortgage loan. Well, lo and behold, what do we have here? At the end of that probationary period, they're told, well, you're not qualified
Yes.
to have this mortgage modification. Now the legislature has already made the funds available to the lending institutions to relieve these mortgage holders of these debts that they owe. But somehow the money is not being used for that purpose. People are not qualified to have this relief, and then they get a bill the month after they have been on the mortgage modification program to pay the difference in total of all the money that they didn't pay while they were paying the reduced fees. So you get a bill of $10,000 or $12,000, and it's due by the 5th of the month. And you're the person who was in the trouble who couldn't pay the regular mortgage payment. Well, you certainly can't pay this one. So now where are we? We are on the road to foreclosure. And in a short period of time, we will be dispossessed and be homeless. So the laws get made, and somehow there's a gap, a crack, or something that the good intentions of the legislators fall between, and you wind up with people who are in jail forever, don't know when they will ever be released, or the people who not only did not save their homes, but lost them under the guise of a government-sponsored program. So, you know, what is a victim to do?
Right.
You know, how does a victim who is disenfranchised because if you've been in prison, then you lose the right to vote, right? Some felons.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Felons. So
not in Illinois though, but in Georgia.
Okay, so in many cases you can't even elect your representatives.
Well, they're trying to get that in the other states now, because all these new requirements requiring that you show a birth certificate,
the voter ID laws,
and all that's going to eliminate a lot of people.
Yeah,
a lot of people from voting.
Yeah, a lot of people, older people, some of them don't even have a birth certificate.
Yeah, but you can show a state ID or a driver's license, but even that is definitely deemed to be onerous. And my understanding is that both the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the ACLU are working to try to strike those laws. Those laws have passed, so now they are working to challenge the constitutionality of those laws.
So here we are. We are, but we still have hope. We're optimistic because we have people like Marian, Perkins, and Mariel, you know, who are awake at the wheel, you know, who are not nodding and who are noticing what is going on around us. But many of our people are not able or not willing to pay attention to the travesties against justice that exist in the world. Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
And that's why they don't respect the system. They've seen so much, you know. And it's just like when I go into the institutions now, I'm actually trying to motivate the inmates, enlighten them to the fact that even though they can't vote right now, when they come out in Illinois, they can vote.
Yes, absolutely.
But what they can do, they can talk to their relatives, talk to their friends, talk to one another, and let them know how important voting is. Those people on the outside can vote in favor of them. See, that's one reason why we can't get any help, because they have such low, you know, they don't have no respect for us as voters, because so many of us say, what good is it going to do? We've just lost all confidence. There is no one in the, say, political field that people actually respect. They're in it, you know. I used to think when I'd see a person of color in a suit and tie, you know, oh, well, here we go, you know. Now, I say, I hope they send me somebody else.
Oh,
because
no.
yeah, that's where I feel,
horrible,
because
yeah.
the average one when they say, wait, I'll go get my boss, and when they come out and it's a person of color, first thing come out of their mouth is nothing I can do. Well, who wants people representing them who can't do anything? We want people who can do something. See, so I told them, when I see them coming with a person of color, I start backing out the door.
Well, I'm happy to see a person of color, because I think, Lou Palmer used to use the phrase, it's enough to make a Negro turn black, because there are still people who can be turned. There are still people, because usually these people are protecting their own interests.
Yeah.
And that's why they don't take risks on your behalf, because they have families to support. They have reasons why they need to follow the instructions of their boss if they're going to keep this job. So you don't, you actually don't want to jeopardize anybody's livelihood. You don't want to do that.
You don't.
So you want to help them figure out how they can help you. You have to have some idea about what it is you need and how they can help you get what you need without running some sort of risk.
Well, usually
And
what I do,
so you have to work with
I hate
people
to
who are
talk
in
to their
compromising
boss usually,
positions.
because see, I am a much older person now. I really don't have time to go through basic training with all of them. And I know, I understand now. I used to kind of resent them. I used to resent the fact that you got a position, you got a ballpoint pen and a telephone, and you're afraid to use either one. So I would try to.
All,
No, I wouldn't do it.
Okay.
Oh, there are some that I talk with.
Okay.
But when I see they got car notes, they got their mortgages,
They got
and I
children in
understand
school.
that. So please give me a few minutes with the person who told you to come out here and tell me you couldn't do anything. Just a few minutes, because like I say, I'm almost 80 now. I don't have time to go through that. I did that for years.
Well, my position is that those who can fight must fight, because those who cannot fight obviously can't.
Right.
So you fight not. I had a friend who was talking to me, and we were talking about the mortgage thing, and she was telling me some things, and she was saying how reluctant she was to enact some strategies, because at some point people give up. At some point people get tired of struggling.
They do.
And even though there's a rock that hasn't been overturned yet, they just don't feel like turning over another rock. And so I was talking to this friend, I said, but you have to do this, because if that works, then you'll be able to share that with somebody. You can't just throw in the towel. If there's something else you can still do, you need to do it. You need to take it all the way, so that if you can succeed in doing this, then you will be an example. You will be able to share this with somebody else. So that's the thing that we need to understand. We need to always do what we can. And sometimes you do have to reach the decision maker, because sometimes you're talking to a person who cannot really make a decision. So they're not in the decision making position, and they're not supposed to, and they're telling you they can't. So that's fine. Have a good day. Let me talk to someone who can make a decision here. And let me hear from that person that you did what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to keep me from getting to that person. Well, I'm going to continue on. Thank you for your help. Now let me talk to the decision maker. And you talk to the decision maker, and if the decision maker says that they're not willing to compromise or negotiate this thing, then you'd have to do the next things you do. And some of the next things you do may involve going to a company that the employee works for, or it may involve legal, and my attorney, Lawrence Kennan, who is my dearest friend and attorney told me, he said, Gloria, you can't sue everybody. Because there was so, I had to get used to injustice as a part of the fabric of this society, because I could not believe that people would try to do the things to people that they would try to do. And I could see a lawsuit. You can't do that. I'm not letting you get away with that, and so I would call up Larry and I would tell Larry about this latest lawsuit I was going to file. And sometimes Larry would say, yes, I think we have a case. And sometimes he said, Gloria, we can't sue everybody. But the thing is, you have to challenge. Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So you have to demand what you think is justice and have somebody prove to you that justice can occasionally occur in this environment.
Yeah.
So you teaching a course in victimology, you teaching a course in women in criminal justice, and what are you finding? Why are you teaching a course in women in criminal justice as opposed to criminal justice and the lay community, or something that encompasses both genders?
Well, the course was offered and I was asked to teach it because of being a former prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and being a girl and then women actually in the community. So we bring to bear in the course a discussion of women and girls as victims of crime, primarily of domestic violence, sexual assault, and now human trafficking. And when we talk about domestic violence, we're also talking about domestic and intimate partner violence, certainly including women and girls who are gay, lesbian, or transgendered. And then when it comes to women and girl offenders, dealing with those particular issues. And the one thing that was observed is that there is a cycle, some causal link between being a victim of a crime earlier in life and unfortunately sometimes becoming an offender later in life. There has been a study of the young people where their parents were brought into the child protection system, basically known as abuse and neglect courts, that those children were the victims of abuse and neglect, and almost 5 or 6 years later, those same young people were over on the delinquency side of juvenile court. And we all know it, talking about 1100 South Hamilton, everybody going in there is not all, half of that courthouse is not just juvenile delinquency. The other side is child protection, which used to be called abuse and neglect. And so that's the biggest problem that you're finding with all victims, is that a potential victim could become a perpetrator, a person where they're silent and they're not heard. Anger, repressed feelings of the issue not being resolved. We'd like to hope that the law can be a tool for conflict resolution. No matter what the issue is, whether or not it's men, women, girls, or boys, conflict resolution. And many times if that conflict is unresolved, it will fester. Or as Langston Hughes talks about with anything, what's the raisin in the sign? Well, it may explode. So it's extremely important for society to address the issues of what's happening with the victims and not to let them smolder, because it does manifest itself in the community, and sometimes in very, very much more dangerous ways than we could ever envision. I remember the young mother of the perpetrator of the young man who did kill Blair Holt. The mom said, my son was getting away from me. He was talking back. He was being bad. I saw where he was going. she said, I didn't think it would go that far. She says, but I know I needed some help with my son, and I didn't get the kind of help I needed to put him in the kind of programs and this and that. And she went and she talked with Mr. and Mrs. Blair Holt, the police officer and the fire commander, and after everything was over, apologized that my son is in the community with your son, and my son is troubled, but I had no idea he would go and hurt your son who had nothing to do with it. So that's why we're all concerned, because we would not want to be innocently hurt by a person who is hurting. As Dr. Carbell says, hurt people hurt people. So so that's what the Women in Criminal Justice course is about, and it ends up being many times, many of the students themselves, they'll talk about instances. And I want to say this, we have men who are in the class as well. Just this past semester, a man, he raised his hand. He said he had been a victim of sexual assault on 3 different occasions. And some of the things that I was talking about, he just didn't even know that, what he was supposed to do or to report. He said it just was mind-blowing to him about what he was supposed to do. And so it's sometimes so many things happen to people and they don't even understand that they can have a recourse with all of the problems that the system does have. Absolutely, I'm definitely hearing you on that situation, but people still do need to know, they do need to report it.
When you talk about getting help, and I know Mariel will attest to this, when you have people who are coming out of so-called correctional institutions, there is no help for them. Yeah. You cannot be confined and controlled over extended periods of time and have no transition from that environment to an environment in which you have some degree of autonomy. Right. There has to be, in the same way that a mother can't find help for her troubled young people so that they can be properly counseled, so that they can be salvaged and deterred from the path that they're on. The same thing is true of people who have been incarcerated. They come out, there is nothing, very little. I know that there are some efforts now. I'm not saying that there are no people out there making efforts, because I know that there are people who are making efforts out there.
Because that's what the money is for the Second Chance Act that Congressman Dan
But
Davis passed.
You need a whole lot more. Because we have so many, we have the most incarceration. We do. There's so much more. But what are they doing? They close down mental health clinics. They close down a mental health hospital. People don't have health care. People can't get treated for even even major things, let alone some mental disorder that has not yet been diagnosed,
And mental is major, and it's something that basically people of color, I'll say black people, we're reluctant to owning up to need for that mental. And it's common. I know when I was on death row with visiting the people on death row, all the Caucasians, that's their defense. They use that in their defense. It's always a mental problem.
By reason of the insanity.
And soon as their children do something, they start bringing up what happened to him when he was little, But black people do not want to own up to having any kind of mental problem. That's why they can't get help a lot of times. They are reluctant. I think I can identify with some of it. Like I was raised up without my mother. My mother died when I was 4. And I still resent people always basing a child's behavior on having a normal household. And when I talk to young people, I tell them whatever household you're in, that's normal for you. But when you forever comparing children with one another, making me feel that I'm less than.
Deficient.
In other words, I'll never be equal to anyone else, because how are you going to give me my mother back? And some of the young people who have mothers aren't able to be mothers. So they're in situations that are sad too. There's mental illness all over. And what I usually share with them is the 12-step program. I tell them they put ours in jail and put theirs in a 12-step program. Well, guess what? If yours going to ever be well for any length of time, they're going to have to work all 12 of those steps. And the 12th step says you can't keep it if you don't give it away. So in order for their children to be healed, they're going to have to share that. They're going to have to reach out to us. Oh, it's going to be just like Dr. King said. We're going to live as brothers and sisters, or we're going to perish as fools.
Yes, absolutely.
See, because it's no way that you can brand mine as unfit to be treated as human, but yours has a mental problem. Yours is addicted to drug and it's a disease. It's not his fault. Mine is addicted to drugs and he's a dope fiend.
He's a criminal.
Right, absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
he don't deserve not even a fair trial. So there's something wrong with that.
Well, we sitting here talking about injustice. That's what's wrong with that.
Yes, it is.
That's what's the disparity, the attempt to make not all men, first of all, to make some men 3/5 of a man. That's part of the problem. So that how are you going to compare a fraction of a man with a whole man? So they're discriminating on finite, never-ending bases. There's always a difference that they can point to. The fact that we had lived through the so-called chattel slavery, if being in that condition, just read Beloved by Toni Morrison, or even read The Bluest Eye by Toni, or any number of people who have treated that experience for us. Kiara Wood says, we have never fully understood slavery, or how maimed we were by that experience, how sick in the soul. We have never had a healing. We've never had any counseling. And so the fact that we are able to string two sentences together and put one foot in front of each other should be commended.
Yes.
But just the same, there used to be a time when if there was an admission of a mental disorder, they would put you in the crazy house. You remember Mantino?
Oh, yes.
Okay, there were times when, you couldn't be eccentric.
No.
Because you would get locked up and get shock treatments and be in a padded cell. So the last thing you wanted to do was to have somebody be defined as being psychotic or having any kind of mental disorder. So that means that if you're sick, you got to conceal your illness because your illness will be used against you. It's kind of like if you're old, you have to lie about your age, because your seniority will be used against you. In how many ways do you have to contort yourself like a pretzel so that somebody with some axe to grind or some private interest won't exploit you for this particular thing about you that they have made it their business to profit from?
Well, look at the mothers who have consented to their children being branded as special ed children for income. They can get public aid as long as that child is special ed. And mothers are consenting to this, and this system is going along with it. These children are being misused from the time they start school. They branding our children. And then they're saying that the mothers in the home who came through the same system are supposed to teach them at home.
Well, the school system gets more money for special needs children.
Yes.
They get more money per child
And the
for
parents
special
get,
needs children. So
parents who can't get income otherwise can get it if they got a special ed child.
special needs.
That's sad.
Special needs child.
Yeah, special needs, and they put them in that special ed classroom, and then they have an income.
Okay, so if you're an impoverished person, you have no revenue, you have no revenue stream or no source of income and so forth and so on. So you sell your valuables. You pawn your watch.
Your children.
You sell your valuables. You give your blood. You sell your blood. You know, you sell whatever you can find to sell, because I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying that you create situations in which people's humanity is challenged, where people cannot behave like human beings, because it becomes my survival is at stake here. I cannot eat. I cannot live indoors. I cannot wear, you know, shoes because I have nothing. You know, when I was in, I've forgotten which African country this was. It probably was Dakar. And I saw the contrast in the poverty and the wealth. And you know in whose hands all the wealth was. And I said, now how can Africans be in Africa this poor, and Europeans be in Africa this wealthy? And that's because poverty does not come with the territory. Poverty is imposed. People don't choose poverty.
No.
People don't decline to be rich. People don't say, I don't want anything. You know, I don't care about having a roof over my head or food to eat and so forth and so on. So you keep people living in abject conditions, and people begin to behave in ways that kind of reflect the condition they're in. Not condoning it at all, but just saying that you don't have to run studies on this, Marian.
Right.
I mean, some
but they
things
have
are
'em.
predictable.
You know, that's the thing that really got to me when I went back to school. I had my babies early and ended up going back to school. But when I took up the courses like psychology and sociology, economics and all that, it depressed me. You know why? Because in sociology, you learn that everything that's happening to us, they know about it. It's in a book. They've studied this. They know if you treat human beings like this, that's
You
the
can
way-
expect this outcome.
That's what they know it. So these people who are in charge of the educational system, as they call it, they just waiting on us to fail.
So we go write a book and we tell them what they're doing to us.
Yeah.
Like, you know, Michelle's new book, The New Jim Crow. She says
Absolutely.
slavery has not ended.
No.
They found another way to do it.
The 13th Amendment said
Right.
it was just a,
Slavery is abolished.
It was a change.
Unless you have been convicted of a crime.
so they went
Right.
from the white sheet to the black robe,
Right.
and they still got slaves.
So, you know, Michelle Alexander's book is an eye-opening book, but it's eye-opening for us. It is not eye-opening for those who are conducting this social experiment.
They know about
In
it.
which,
They in on
you
it.
know, it's predictable. You can't run a country, and you certainly cannot run the world when you don't know what people are going to do next. You know, you have to be able to make some predictions and some predictions. They call them on the market, they call them futures. You have to know what the future corn crop is going to yield. You can't just be looking at
They
the field
know what
today
it's
and
gonna
seeing
yield
how
because
many
they planted it.
stalks
Right.
Right.
And they did plan it. And when we look at, I'm just going to name several laws. The 1985 Truth in Sentencing Act, which stated that a person has to serve 85% of their time, led to people being in prison longer, moving from the indeterminate to the determinate sentencing. That occurred in the 80s. The federal sentencing guidelines, which were passed in 1987, were mandatory. I must say that now, as we speak today, the federal sentencing guidelines are advisory, but it took almost 20 years, almost a whole generation grew up under the federal sentencing guidelines. And then in the 1990s, every state in the United States of America, and the state legislators moved to try juveniles as adults. And so we are really talking about a very recent phenomenon of the laws coming on the books at the same time that there were so many economic changes in America. When you think about the 1960s and the 70s, it was a war on poverty, and believe it or not, to some extent, they have the data that showed that, including African Americans, large percentages of people moved away from that poverty line because of an all-in-all assault war on poverty. But at the same time, the American economy itself was much better, fueled by the big three, auto industry, etc. You move into the 80s, then you start talking about many more corporations leaving America. You also start talking about the family structure where the women are having to work, in addition to the assault of the laws, in addition to the infusion of the drugs. It was just like a 1, 2, 3, 4 punch. I mean, just how much can someone take? And so it all fused together. We're now in a period, believe it or not, the criminal justice system wants to come out of this, for lack of a better word, crime control model, to be quite frank, because it's just too expensive. So for some people it is a moral situation, but for others, a lot of situations are based on profit. There was a situation that occurred in Philadelphia where the judges, and they were actually not only had to step down, I believe that they were actually prosecuted because there was a private detention center, and so what was happened, the person who owned the company needed some more juveniles in the system and said, come on, judges, bring me some more kids, and some of those kids actually should not have gone. And so for the judges to even be in collusion with something like that, they were getting a little extra money for sending some extra juveniles.
Extra money. I read
Absolutely, about that. So you talk about the private prisons. Remembering though, Illinois does not have private prisons. We have quite a bit of prisons, but we don't have, our state did not allow private prisons to come into our state, but a lot of states did, including Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
But we
dealing
also
with the fallout.
We farm inmates.
Yeah.
So we don't. Not everybody who does or is accused or convicted of a crime in Illinois does the time in Illinois.
Right.
So
Now
even
that's
though we don't have private prisons,
right,
we can funnel. Is that
Yes.
organized? Is that human trafficking? So you organize, you pick them up here, you funnel them through here, they wind up over there.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to visit a family member
It
who is incarcerated in another state.
Exactly.
Right.
You know,
You're
and
totally
the phone
correct.
company, that makes the money from the phone calls.
Absolutely,
I
because they're
mean,
calling collects, and moms has to say, I'm really sorry, I just cannot take another collect phone call. You've made my bill so high, and so you're cutting off those relationships.
And who determines who's tried as an adult? I have been to Springfield several times, and each time that I have been present, when legislators was discussing this tried as adults, the percentage of colored, black, whatever you want to call them, that's who is tried as adult.
You know what?
They decide who's tried as adult.
You're totally correct. But some of it, I know it's a real big nuance. First of all, there are 3 ways of trying juveniles as adults. The prosecutor can have the discretion itself to do that. Now, I'll tell you, Illinois doesn't use that particular method, but Florida does, and so Florida does that. So when you had the 12-year-old in Florida who was Lionel Tate, who was the youngest person to be tried as an adult, it's because the prosecutor, in her discretion, decided, well, this 12-year-old is going to be tried as an adult. And this involved the case of the young man taking the little girl and doing a worldwide wrestling move on her. His position was that even though he was 12 years old, that he did not know that worldwide wrestling is not real. In fact, when I discussed with some of my students, some of them expressed that they didn't know that worldwide wrestling was not real, that it's an entertainment. Anyway, the prosecutors can decide whether or not you're tried as an adult. You can be tried as an adult after a judicial transfer hearing where the judge is listening to mitigating factors which favor the young person, and aggravating factors that deal with the nature of the crime, and then the law. And in Illinois, a lot of laws have been passed. So, for example, if you are trafficking drugs within 1,000 feet of a school or a church or a park district, then you are automatically tried as an adult. And I remember speaking with former Illinois State Representative Art Turner in the West Side community, where he used to be the state representative, and said that a church is defined as not just some of the bigger churches that we think of, but a storefront church. If it's a church, if the church says it's a church, then it's a church, and that's because under the First Amendment, America allows people to have their churches. So what was happening? You had so many people that were trafficking drugs within 1,000 feet of even a storefront church, and they were being tried as an adult. And almost 90% of the people being tried were African American, and after being African American, the next group was Latino.
The last time I attended, it was 100%.
It was 100. It was 100%.
Before that, it was 96%.
96%.
And this was this was not in any other state. This was in Illinois.
Well, Illinois is
when whites, when they start trying their children as adults, they get involved. We say ooh until it happens to one of ours. We don't even pick up on it. We don't feel a sense of any kind of ownership to this child until he's some kin to us.
Right, where every child is
and before you know it, they done round them all up.
Yeah.
You know, I used to tell people a long time ago, it's impossible for you to feel that you have made it when your child is walking around with 2 loaves of bread, one under each arm, and mine is hungry. That hungry child gonna figure out how to get some of that bread from under the arm.
That's exactly true.
So that's how it affects all of us, and we got to wake up. I don't know what we're gonna do, but I know I'm out in the penitentiaries. I tell the young people, it's about the only place I know where I can talk to them without their phone going off.
Okay,
you know?
I got you. Well, the other thing too is very, very carefully, very, very much moving to change these laws. The federal sentencing guidelines are no longer mandatory. It's a big, big win, and on top of it, the law has now said that you can move retroactively. So now there are so many people who are in the federal prisons 20 years on these drug sentences are now going to be able to have sentence cuts or to be able to come out of prison. So we have to work with the laws.
They say they're going to let some of those out.
In terms of trying juveniles as adults, our U.S. Supreme Court in 2005, it was a relatively conservative U.S. Supreme Court, did vote to abolish the death penalty against juveniles. And the United States of America was one of only 3 countries that still allowed the death penalty. So that was a big thing in 2005. So there is a movement afoot to try to change some of these laws that have made it horrific. Because the bad thing, America, when it goes before the United Nations, with all of the countries being present, and it is known as the country with the highest incarceration rate in the entire global community, it is quite... It's an example of a human rights violation. It's a human rights violation, particularly when we're not talking about millions and millions of people being murderers or sex offenders. We're talking about people being incarcerated, drug offenders, PSMV, possession of stolen motor vehicle. Even though I'll tell you, if you go out and your car is stolen, believe me, you are upset and you want somebody to get your car back. And I believe that the person should be prosecuted, but then the issue would be, well, what kind of sentence should they get? What should they do? It used to be that people would, I know people may not want to get so close to the victim, but they would go to the victim's house and clean up the house and do whatever they had to do. They would kind of make up whatever they had done wrong to the victim by actually doing some things for the victim. Now the people are just so separated, both the victim and the offender. There's a movement afoot to try to see when the offender has actually done wrong to the lady. I said, do you understand you took that lady's car? She came out to the mall. I hadn't really thought about it the way you've talked about it. This is the actual lady. Now then you see her face. She had groceries and you took her car. Do you understand? And they have had many discussions where offenders have actually said, I'm sorry. So we're not saying that the person should not be punished. They should. But should they get 5 or 10 years in prison for PSMV? No, absolutely should not. But
and never be able to get a job when they come out.
I
Absolutely.
have a question to ask you, because the last time You will hear Mary. We were looking at mandatory minimum sentencing. How does that fit in with the guidelines?
Guidelines.
Okay.
It does. It does. Well, what happens is, under the federal sentencing guidelines, the judge opens up the book, that's in federal court, and he looks at, and the one thing is the amount of drugs trafficked. He doesn't look at, is it a first-time offender? He doesn't look at any type of mitigating factors or anything else like that. What was the person's school record? What was their family life? He looks at, well, this person has been charged with conspiracy to distribute drugs. And I mentioned that crime of conspiracy a lot because there are a lot of people who are in prison, not so much because they were the mastermind, but because they were with the person who was the wrongdoer. And that includes the girlfriend and even the male friend. So I'm not trying to say that people are not committing crime. What I am saying is that many times these people are not the lead ringers, but they get the 24 and a half years in federal prison, just like the principal. Principal spelled Principal, not like principal of a school.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, to make a long story short, that is what happens. It takes the discretion away from the judges. So they're mandatory.
Okay.
And the big poster child for the case was Kimba Smith, which was the college student, and it might have been, it shouldn't have been, but because she was a college student, because she came from a two-parent home, because she came from a suburban home, the system looked at her case. She got 24 and a half years in federal prison for trafficking drugs up and down the East Coast, because she was in Hampton University, Hampton, Virginia, going up and down D.C., Washington, D.C., Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. The boyfriend got killed in a drug deal, gone bad, because that's what happens. You know, you're trying to get the money, and the person says, you owe me some money, whatever. He died, and the U.S. Attorney's Office said, we want you to cooperate with our investigation.
Oh.
She's the girlfriend. She's pregnant, carrying his baby. Her position is, I don't know. So the U.S. Attorney's Office said, well, we are going to prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. First-time offender, she got 24 and a half years in federal prison. That was about 1994 or 1995, because the federal sentencing guidelines were in existence. President Bill Clinton, former Bill Clinton, did commute her sentence. He did not grant her clemency, but he commuted her sentence. So she only served about 6.5 or 7 years in prison. She actually had her baby in federal prison. And when you are pregnant in federal prison, you are shackled. You are shackled when you're birthing your baby. So, you know, you're still incarcerated, but you're actually so that's a whole nother show, Dr. Peasley.
Well, you know, we're going to have it on another show, because they keep flashing cues
Like it's
at
time
me
to
and
go.
telling me it's time for us to go.
Okay.
Thank you for shedding a little light on that mandatory minimum sentencing. As I said, this is a Justice for All the series, because there's just so much to talk about and so much to try to grasp. Not that you could ever understand it, because injustice should never be understood.
Right.
You just could not understand why people should not be all treated fairly and justly. But I thank you so much, Attorney Marian Perkins and Mariel Johnson.
Thank you.
And continue your good work in the community, because you deserve, you should, now you talk about honoring somebody.
Really?
This lady